A homeless veteran was arrested for trespassing behind a library on a freezing night, but when the judge opened his forgotten file, she uncovered a connection to her own past that no one saw coming. What followed turned a simple hearing into something the entire town would never forget. In 2022, in Bozeman, Montana, a small courtroom on the edge of the city opened its doors to another routine case. The morning air outside was crisp and cold, leaving a faint mist on the courthouse steps. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over the sparse wooden benches and the worn carpet that lined the floor. The judge, clerks, and a few members of the public settled into their places, their faces marked by the quiet boredom of another day of minor proceedings. At the defense table sat a man whose presence seemed almost to blend into the background. Walter Bennett, 65 years old, with thinning gray hair and deep lines etched across his weathered face, waited for his name to be called. His clothes hung loosely from his thin frame, a battered denim jacket, frayed at the cuffs and collar, and a pair of heavy work boots, their soles cracked and patched with duct tape. His hands, resting in his lap, bore the scars of old injuries, and his posture spoke of years of carrying burdens heavier than most could imagine. The charge was simple: unlawful entry and disturbance of public order. Walter had been found sleeping behind the city library, huddled near a service vent for warmth during a night when temperatures had fallen below freezing. The library staff had called the authorities after closing time, more out of protocol than malice. When officers arrived, Walter had not resisted, but simply stood up with a slow, painful effort and followed them without a word. The prosecutor, a young man in a sharp gray suit, outlined the case with detached efficiency. He recommended assigning Walter to community service and issuing a restriction order, barring him from approaching public buildings in the downtown area. His voice was steady, clinical, devoid of personal feeling. To him, Walter was one more name on a long list of petty offenders who clogged the court's calendar. The courtroom was nearly empty. A few bored spectators sat scattered among the benches, flipping through their phones or whispering to one another. None spared more than a glance for Walter. In their eyes, he was just another homeless man who had slipped through the cracks, another worn-out figure whose story was neither unique nor important. His presence elicited neither sympathy nor anger, only the faint, collective irritation reserved for the reminders of society's failures. Walter kept his head slightly bowed, his gaze fixed somewhere on the scratched surface of the table before him. He knew the pattern well. Citation, arrest, brief hearing, another mark on his record, another door closed. There was a dull inevitability to it all, a rhythm of disappointment that he had long since accepted. He did not look at the judge. He did not search the room for a friendly face. He simply waited, as he had waited many times before, for the machinery of justice to turn and leave him a little more forgotten than he already was. Outside the tall courtroom windows, the gray skies of Montana hung low and heavy, threatening another blanket of snow. The mountains in the distance were obscured by mist, their outlines softened into vague shadows. The cold seeped through the courthouse walls, lingering in the air, a quiet reminder of the season's brutality and of the harsh reality that awaited Walter beyond the courtroom doors. The gavel struck once, sharp and decisive. The proceedings had begun, and Walter Bennett, unnoticed by nearly all, sat at the center of a process that neither recognized his past nor cared for his future. Judge Emily Davis presided over the session with the calm, methodical demeanor that had earned her respect throughout Bozeman. At 42 years old, she had built a reputation as a woman of principle, someone who valued fairness over appearances and sought justice beyond paperwork. She wore her dark robe with quiet authority, her hair neatly pinned back, her eyes sharp and focused behind thin-framed glasses. As the court clerk handed her the file on Walter Bennett, she took it in her hands with the habitual motion of years of practice. She flipped through the first pages mechanically: arrest report, officer's testimony, incident summary. It was all standard, the sort of minor case that filled her docket every winter when homelessness and cold collided. But as she turned to the appendices, something unfamiliar caught her eye. A page clipped separately to the back of the file. Curious, Emily paused, adjusting her glasses slightly. It was a service record, an official military document summarizing Bennett's years in the United States Army. She read through the list: Enlistment date in 1999, deployment to Afghanistan in 2001, honorable discharge in 2005. Her gaze slowed as she reached the decorations section. Among the listed medals, the Army Commendation Medal, the Purple Heart, there was one that made her breath catch, the Bronze Star for heroic achievement in combat. For a moment, the hum of the courtroom faded. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the file. A rush of old, buried emotions surged within her, unwelcome yet unstoppable. Memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit pushed their way to the surface. Her father, Captain George Davis, had also served in Afghanistan. He had died there in 2002, killed during a mission in Kandahar province when she was still a teenager. Most of what she knew about him had come from secondhand stories, faded photographs, and the carefully curated memories her grandmother shared. She remembered the way her grandmother's voice softened whenever she spoke of the soldiers who had served with George. One name had surfaced more than once, always spoken with a mixture of sadness and reverence: Sergeant Bennett. Emily had never connected that name to anyone she might encounter in her own life. It had been part of a chapter she believed firmly closed, a world of battlefields and sacrifices distant from her court, her city, her careful existence. But now, seeing the name printed plainly before her, matched to the worn figure sitting silently in her courtroom, she felt the walls between past and present blur. A story once told over tearful Sunday dinners came flooding back. A young sergeant who had pulled several wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, suffering grave injuries himself. Her grandmother had mentioned that George's last letters home spoke of a sergeant he admired, a man who had stayed behind to protect the others when retreat seemed the only sane option. Emily sat back slightly in her chair, struggling to compose herself. She stared across the courtroom at Walter Bennett, who remained hunched and motionless at the defense table. His appearance betrayed nothing of the man described in her father's letters. He was a ghost of himself, hidden beneath the weight of years and misfortune. Yet something in the set of his shoulders, the weary endurance he carried, whispered of a once unyielding spirit. The realization settled heavily on her. The man facing judgment in her courtroom was not merely another transient offender. He was a fragment of her own history, a living reminder of sacrifice and loyalty that her city, her community, and perhaps she herself had long since forgotten. Emily closed the file slowly, her mind racing. The proceedings could no longer be routine. This case would require more than the standard application of the law. It would demand the courage to see the human being beyond the charges, to honor debts long overdue. She exhaled quietly, steeling herself. Whatever the next steps would be, she knew she could not let the past be buried under bureaucracy once again. Judge Emily Davis, her composure strained under the weight of sudden realization, called for a recess. She struck her gavel once, her voice steady but tinged with urgency, then retreated quickly to her chambers. The heavy door closed behind her with a muted thud, sealing her away from the curious murmurs of the courtroom. Inside her office, the familiar surroundings, framed degrees, certificates of merit, shelves lined with thick law books, offered little comfort. Emily moved to her desk, her heart still racing, and activated the secure terminal. Her fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard before she began searching through the military archives, using credentials she retained from her work with Veterans Court Initiatives. She typed in Walter Bennett's name, cross-referencing it with known units deployed to Afghanistan during the early years of the conflict. It took only a few minutes to find what she needed. Walter Bennett had been assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 10th Mountain Division. Her pulse quickened as she delved deeper into the records. Among the lists of missions and operations, she found Captain George Davis's name, attached to the same battalion and operating in the same sector during 2002. Further digging uncovered an after-action report dated April 18, 2002. It detailed an ambush in the narrow passes of Panjwai district, where a convoy was trapped under heavy insurgent fire. According to the report, several soldiers had been gravely wounded during the first moments of the attack. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Walter Bennett had disregarded direct orders to retreat, instead moving under fire to rescue 3 wounded men, including Captain Davis. His actions had directly contributed to saving lives, though at great personal cost. Bennett had sustained a severe concussion and shrapnel wounds, which led to long-term complications. Emily leaned back in her chair, absorbing the magnitude of what she had uncovered. This was no vague association, no distant connection fabricated by coincidence. Walter Bennett had been there during her father's final days, had fought beside him, and had sacrificed his own health in doing so. As she read further, the story darkened. The post-service records painted a grim picture. After his honorable discharge, Walter struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic traumatic brain injury, he cycled through jobs in construction and security, work that demanded more from his battered body than it could give. Each loss deepened his isolation. His marriage crumbled under the strain, and without strong advocacy, his applications for veteran benefits became mired in bureaucratic delays. Medical bills mounted. Foreclosure followed. Eventually, he slipped into homelessness, a slow erasure that no one seemed to notice. Emily closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the quiet tragedy laid bare in the sterile language of reports and clinical notes. In the courtroom, Walter appeared as another vagrant at the margins of society, invisible to all but the legal system tasked with managing his existence. Yet the truth revealed a man whose courage and sacrifice had once embodied the very ideals their community claimed to honor. She opened her eyes, a new determination settling within her. Walter Bennett was not merely a defendant on her docket. He was a living testament to debts unpaid, a man who had once stood in defense of others and now stood abandoned. She could not change the years that had passed, nor could she undo the neglect he had suffered. But here today, she had the power to alter the course of what came next. Straightening in her chair, Emily prepared herself to return to the courtroom. The law demanded impartiality, but justice, true justice, demanded recognition of the whole truth. She would not allow this man's story to be dismissed with a few lines on a court ledger. The turn of fate had brought Walter Bennett into her courtroom for a reason, and Emily Davis was determined not to ignore it. Judge Emily Davis stood in the stillness of her chambers, the low hum of the courthouse barely reaching through the heavy wooden door. The case file lay open on her desk, the pages fanned out as though urging her to look deeper. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before turning to her computer. The old desktop whirred to life as she accessed the secured veteran service databases, a privilege granted to her through her long-standing work with community veteran initiatives. Her fingers moved with urgency, typing Walter Bennett's name into the search fields, pairing it with keywords tied to military service in Afghanistan. The results came back almost instantly. Bennett had been assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, under the 10th Mountain Division. Her eyes scanned the record, stopping short as a familiar designation appeared alongside his name. Captain George Davis, her father. They had served together in the same battalion during the same brutal months in the Panjwai district. Emily delved deeper into the reports, pulling up archived mission logs and after-action reports from early 2002. One document, dated April 18, 2002, stood out immediately. It detailed a disastrous ambush on a convoy moving supplies through one of the treacherous valleys. Enemy fire had erupted from the cliffs above, pinning the soldiers in a kill zone. Casualties were immediate. Amid the chaos, Sergeant Walter Bennett had taken extraordinary action. Ignoring orders to pull back, he moved into the line of fire, dragging wounded men behind makeshift cover and providing suppressive fire that allowed the remaining convoy members to regroup and counterattack. In the report's terse military language, it was clear that without Bennett's bravery, many more would have died that day. His efforts had earned him a recommendation for the Bronze Star. However, the aftermath was equally clear. Bennett had sustained a severe concussion, suffered from multiple soft tissue injuries, and later exhibited signs of traumatic brain injury, a diagnosis that, while acknowledged, had not prevented his eventual discharge once his physical fitness began to deteriorate. Emily leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the starkness of the facts. She forced herself to continue reading, combing through post-service notes attached to his military file. Walter had struggled to adapt to civilian life. The records showed repeated hospitalizations for symptoms consistent with PTSD, difficulties maintaining employment, failed attempts at rehabilitation. Financial instability led to foreclosure on his modest home. His marriage ended in quiet, bitter separation. Appeals for enhanced veteran benefits had languished for years, trapped in bureaucratic backlog and oversight. There was no single moment where everything had fallen apart for Walter Bennett. It had been a slow unraveling, each thread snapping under the accumulated weight of neglect and invisibility. What disturbed Emily most was how unremarkable it all seemed within the system. A decorated soldier had been allowed to vanish into the cracks of society without alarm or outrage. She turned her gaze toward the courtroom windows visible through the gap in the door. The winter light was dim and pale, casting long, faded shadows across the floor. Somewhere beyond that glass sat Walter, waiting to be processed like any other case, unaware that his life story was unfolding once again behind closed doors. Emily closed the file with deliberate care, her decision already forming. This was no mere procedural case anymore. It was a reckoning. She could not erase what Walter had endured, nor could she bring back the years that had slipped away from him. But she could ensure that from this day forward, he would no longer be treated as invisible. He deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be honored, not just for the sake of her father's memory, but because it was right. Squaring her shoulders, she prepared to return to the courtroom. The law could be rigid, but justice, she reminded herself, must remain human. As she stepped through the doorway, leaving the shelter of her chambers behind, Emily knew the course of this hearing, and perhaps Walter Bennett's life, was about to change. When Judge Emily Davis returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. There was a new weight to her presence, something quieter but far more commanding than before. She settled into her seat, briefly reviewing her notes, then turned her full attention to Walter Bennett, who remained seated at the defense table, his posture rigid with resignation. The courtroom, though sparsely populated, felt suddenly dense with anticipation. Emily requested that Walter approach the bench. The man stood slowly, joints stiff from cold and age, and shuffled forward with careful steps. He stood before her, head bowed slightly, awaiting whatever judgment would fall next. Rather than proceeding directly to sentencing, Emily began asking him a series of questions about his past. She spoke in a formal tone, but there was a gentleness beneath it, a thread of compassion woven into her otherwise firm demeanor. Walter responded with the same steady reserve that had characterized his military service. His answers were brief, factual, devoid of embellishment. He spoke of enlisting after high school, of deployments to dangerous provinces, of firefights and long nights under open skies. He described his injuries without complaint, his return home without bitterness, his gradual loss of footing in a society that had no place for broken soldiers. As he spoke, a gradual hush fell over the room. The rustling of papers, the clicking of pens, the shifting of bodies, all ceased. Even those who had previously been disengaged leaned forward, drawn in by the understated gravity of his testimony. The story that unfolded was not told with theatrics or pleas for pity. It emerged instead through the worn timbre of Walter's voice, in the pauses where memory caught and had to be wrestled back under control. In the back rows, a woman who had been absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone lowered it slowly to her lap. A young man who had come to observe court proceedings for a college class wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, pretending to scratch his face. The courtroom, which only an hour earlier had viewed Walter as a statistic, now saw him as something entirely different, a living witness to loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. When Walter finished speaking, Emily paused, giving the silence room to deepen. She reviewed the facts once more, then set aside her papers altogether. With a measured tone, she addressed the court, proposing not merely a reconsideration of the charges against Walter Bennett, but a larger review of how the county treated its veterans. Her voice carried clear and firm across the room, leaving little space for argument. The prosecutor, caught off guard by the sudden shift in direction, hesitated visibly. For a brief moment, he opened his mouth to object, but as his eyes met those of the judge and then glanced toward Walter, he simply nodded, yielding without a word. The severity of the situation had eclipsed procedural instincts. There would be no opposition today. The formal charges against Walter were dismissed in full. The court record would reflect not guilt or criminality, but instead the necessity for intervention and support. Emily further ordered that Walter's situation be referred immediately to a special commission, one tasked with reassessing veteran assistance programs and recommending systemic reforms. As the gavel fell for the final time, closing the session, the bailiffs moved to escort Walter from the courtroom. Yet their approach was different now. There was no grabbing at arms, no hurried escort toward the exit. Instead, one officer extended a hand to Walter, steadying him gently as he stepped away from the defense table. Another cleared a path, ensuring he could walk without the burden of watchful suspicion. Walter moved through the aisle with slow, deliberate steps. He no longer seemed weighed down by shame. In that moment, he was not a defendant leaving a courtroom in defeat. He was a soldier being honored, however belatedly, by a community finally remembering its debt. Heads turned to follow his passage, and for once it was not out of scorn or pity, but out of respect. Beyond the heavy courthouse doors, the gray light of Montana's winter waited. But inside, where it mattered most, something irreversible had begun to change. In the weeks that followed the courtroom proceedings, change began to stir in Bozeman. What had started as a single act of recognition soon grew into something larger and more permanent. Under the quiet but determined leadership of Judge Emily Davis, the City Council approved the establishment of a new veteran assistance program, the first of its kind in the region. It was designed not just to provide temporary aid, but to rebuild lives that had been fractured by years of service and subsequent neglect. Walter Bennett became the program's first participant. His case served as both a catalyst and a symbol, a reminder that true patriotism extended beyond waving flags on holidays. The initiative offered him what he had not dared to hope for in years: a place to call home, regular medical care tailored to the complex needs of combat veterans, and access to counseling services that treated trauma with patience and dignity, rather than suspicion. Walter's new apartment was modest, located within a freshly renovated complex near the edge of downtown, designated exclusively for veterans in need. It was small, a simple one-bedroom unit with clean walls, sturdy furniture, and a view of the distant mountains that framed Bozeman's skyline. For the first time in years, Walter stepped into a space where he could lock the door behind him and know he was safe. On the day he moved in, he carried with him a single treasured possession: a battered, tarnished medal tucked carefully into an old shoebox. It was the Bronze Star, awarded years ago but never properly presented. It had survived the collapse of his old life, traveling with him through shelters, hospital stays, and lonely nights beneath overpasses. Now it sat quietly on his kitchen counter, waiting for its place of honor. The community, galvanized by the events that had unfolded in the courthouse, organized a public ceremony to right past wrongs. Flyers went up around town, and on a chilly Saturday afternoon, residents gathered in the small city park at the center of Bozeman. Folding chairs lined the grass, a makeshift podium stood under the bare trees, and the American flag rippled gently in the crisp breeze. Walter stood stiffly off to one side as the ceremony began, uncomfortable under the attention but determined to see it through. Local officials spoke briefly, offering thanks and apologies too long delayed. Veterans from earlier wars and younger service members alike filled the audience, many wearing their own service jackets, their expressions solemn and proud. When Walter's name was called, he approached the podium with measured steps, feeling every eye in the park on him. A military officer in dress uniform waited with a small velvet box. With great formality, the officer opened it to reveal a newly minted Bronze Star medal gleaming under the winter sun. Alongside it, other ribbons and commendations were displayed, affirming honors that had long been buried under the dust of forgotten paperwork. Walter accepted the awards with hands that trembled slightly, not from frailty but from the overwhelming flood of emotions surging through him. Applause rose around the park. Not the perfunctory clapping of obligation, but something deeper, fuller, a collective acknowledgement of sacrifices once overlooked. Standing before the crowd, Walter felt the hard shell that had enclosed his heart for so many years begin to crack. The cold weight of despair and loneliness, worn like a second skin for decades, began to lift. He no longer felt invisible. In that moment, he was seen, honored, and restored not just by medals or words, but by the simple, undeniable presence of a community willing to stand beside him. As the ceremony concluded, Walter caught sight of Judge Emily Davis standing among the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. No words passed between them, but none were needed. The road ahead was still uncertain, still marked with the scars of his journey, but now, for the first time in a very long time, Walter Bennett felt ready to walk it. 6 months had passed since Walter Bennett had been handed a second chance at life. The seasons had shifted in Bozeman, Montana, and the biting cold of winter had gradually given way to the hesitant warmth of spring. Snow still clung to the distant mountains, but in the city, the sidewalks were wet with meltwater, and patches of green began to emerge from the thawing earth. Walter had found a new purpose in the place where, not long ago, he had been treated as a trespasser. The Bozeman Public Library, once a shelter from the cold and a symbol of his invisibility, had now become the center of his new life. Hired as a consultant for youth outreach programs, Walter spent his days mentoring teenagers and young adults, sharing lessons not drawn from textbooks but from a life lived with resilience and quiet courage. He spoke to them about the importance of memory, of understanding that every freedom and comfort they enjoyed had been shaped by sacrifices often invisible to the world around them. He never framed himself as a hero. Instead, he offered the idea that honor was not a grand gesture but a series of small choices made in hard moments when no one was watching. His words carried a gravity born not from rhetoric but from lived experience, and the young people who listened sensed it instinctively. Over time, Walter's story spread quietly through the community. Articles appeared in the local paper. Teachers invited him to speak at schools. The people of Bozeman, who once might have crossed the street to avoid him, now greeted him by name. His presence became a symbol of the deeper truth that lay behind the surface of every life, that even the most forgotten souls could carry histories of valor and grace. Emily Davis visited the library from time to time. She came without fanfare, slipping in during quiet afternoons to exchange a few words with Walter or simply to sit nearby, reading. Between them, there existed a bond that needed no acknowledgement. It was built not on obligation or debt, but on a shared understanding of loss, resilience, and the quiet restoration of dignity. Their conversations were brief, often touching on ordinary things. A book recommendation, a shared observation about the weather. But in every interaction, there lingered a mutual respect that words could not fully express. One afternoon, as the first true warmth of spring settled over the town, Walter found himself sitting alone on a bench outside the library. The air was crisp but gentle, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant sound of laughter from the park across the street. Children raced across the damp grass, their jackets flapping behind them like bright banners. Parents chatted nearby, basking in the simple pleasures of an ordinary day. Walter watched them with a quiet, steady gaze. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt no gnawing ache of loneliness, no pressing weight of sorrow. Instead, there was a soft, enduring sense of peace. His journey had been long and bruising, marked by loss and forgetting. But somehow, through the grace of unexpected kindness and the stubborn endurance of his own spirit, he had come home again, not to a building or a battlefield, but to a community that had chosen to remember him. He leaned back against the bench, the sun warm on his face, and allowed himself a small, genuine smile. It was a simple thing, unnoticed by the passing world, but to Walter Bennett, it meant everything. In that moment, he understood that true belonging was not found in medals or ceremonies, but in the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. After all the miles traveled and years endured, he had found his place once more among those who had learned, finally, to see him.